This is part 6 of a series on the 2017 UK general election, which will discuss the final polls and incorrectly guess the result. First, the parties. Most of the parties in the UK populate an economically left-wing, socially liberal bloc on the political compass, with the Liberal Democrats in the economic centre and the Conservatives and UKIP out on their own in an economically right-wing, socially authoritarian corner. Now a map. This is what the UK looks like in 2017. Metropolitan and northern regions lean left and vote Labour, whereas rural and southern regions lean right and vote Conservative. Scotland is dominated by left-wing politics, with the Conservatives, UKIP and Liberal Democrats combined making up less than a quarter of the electorate. Now some polls. This graph from the BBC represents the final polls taken before the election, and they clearly show that the Conservative Party, despite tremendous gains made by Labour, are ahead by about 6 points, plus or minus 3. However, as Nate Silver at 538 points out, polls in the UK have historically been slightly more inaccurate than advertised, typically missing the final margin by an average of about 5 percentage points. In response to this inaccuracy, pollsters determined that they were oversampling young left-wing voters, and have since adjusted their methods to ostensibly be more representative of the UK voting population, but this may have caused a swing in the opposite direction, as Labour support typically does come from younger voters and Jeremy Corbyn is extremely popular with voters aged 18 to 24. Martin Baxter of electoralcalculus.com gives the Conservatives a 65% chance for a majority. He predicts a gain of 31 seats for a working government majority of 48, driven by the collapse of the UKIP vote in favour of tactical voting for the Conservative Party. This is certainly plausible, especially given the two parties' ideological proximity on the political compass, but in 2015, popular support for the UK Independence Party appears to have largely come from disaffected Liberal Democrat voters, and it's far from certain that they're in favour of the hard Brexit sort of independence from the EU that these parties are now advocating. The BBC identifies 110 constituencies as battleground states, defined as those where the gap between the first and second place was under 10% in 2015, and suggests that the issue of Brexit in these constituencies will define the outcome of the election. But 10% seems a little high for an election where the national polls, assuming they're accurate, show the two largest parties separated by an average of 6% on the eve of the election. There are 67 constituencies below the 6% threshold, 29 of which are already held by the Conservative Party, and of the 38 that aren't, the Conservatives are the second largest party in 25. Applying this the other way, the most seats that Labour can gain at the 6% threshold is 22. In Scotland, the SNP already control 54 out of 59 seats and can gain up to 4 and lose up to 2 at the 6% threshold. So these would appear to be the broad parameters of the election, but only time will tell what actually happens. If the adjusted polls are accurate, the Conservatives could gain a handful of seats, and if young people turn out to vote, they're likely to lose a handful of seats. But if I had to guess, and I suppose I do, it seems likely given Jeremy Corbyn's high popularity with young voters that the polls have swung too far right and are now underrepresenting this group. It also seems reasonable to think that a large number of 2015's UKIP voters aren't happy with a hard Brexit, and since the Liberal Democrats want a second EU referendum, they might vote tactically for Labour in order to prevent a hard Brexit. I'd be surprised if Labour could win an outright majority, but I suspect that the Conservative Party will lose seats. If they lose a lot, the result could be a hung parliament. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series. Please consider supporting this channel through Patreon if you'd like to see more content like this going forward.